welcome to this DDI CADcast. My name is Cody Armstrong, and the topic today is Assemblies. So, thank you for joining us for this DDI What's New 2013 CADcast. And like I said, the topic for today is Assemblies. And this is actually part 2 of a two-part series on the Assemblies topic. So, let's get into what we're going to cover today. So as I mentioned, this is part 2 of a two-part series. This is the last bit of a two-part series, and I have a few other things I'd like to get into in Assemblies. So going through the list, we're going to start off with some enhancements to interference detection, some enhancements for large assemblies, working with large assemblies, mass properties, got to work over as well, mates in mirrored subassemblies, got some enhancements with the 2013 release. Also, snapshots are supported at the assembly level. We also have a new assembly feature, swept cut, and then lastly some small interface changes to selecting sub-assemblies. So without further ado, let's get started. So jumping into SolidWorks, one of the first things I'd like to go over are the enhancements to interference detection. And there are a few new enhancements I want to point out with interference detection that make it a little bit more user-friendly. So let's jump right into it. If I go to Tools, Interference Detection, one of the first things you'll notice is this new option for excluded components. Okay? And I can check this, and just like you'd imagine, I can come in here and select a couple of components, and they will be excluded from the interference detection. Also new is this option to hide excluded components from view. Right? So if I go through and define these excluded components, I can also set them to hide as well, and they'll get rid of those in the model. Okay. So excluded components is new for 2013. It just allows you a quick, easy way to exclude certain parts from the interference detection. Another thing that's new is the way that interference detection handles fasteners. If I go ahead and run this, I'm going to hit calculate. You'll see it finds a few different interferences, and a lot of these have to do with hole wizard holes and toolbox bolts, okay, at least in this case. So you'll see I have a lot of hole wizard holes in this model, but I also have a lot of toolbox bolts. And in previous versions, what people often did is they came down here and created a fasteners folder. The reason these are detected as interferences is because by default SolidWorks, when I create a hole wizard hole, for instance, uses the tap drill size to define the hole size. And then, of course, the bolt is going to be the nominal size of the bolt, the major diameter for the bolt, and of course those two are going to overlap. So by default, SolidWorks will see that as an interference. And in previous versions, what people would do is they would just come in here and check create a fasteners folder. That would put all the interferences that were related with fasteners into its own folder. But now we have a little bit better way of detecting whether or not it's a real interference. And what I mean by that is, it may be an interference, but it may not be that the data matches. In other words, I could have an M6 bolt and an M8 hole. Now you'll actually get a new option that says create matching cosmetic threads folder. And so it'll tell me more than just if the interference has to do with a fastener. Now it'll actually tell me if I have matching cosmetic thread profiles. And what I mean by matching is the bolt information, right, the cosmetic thread information on the bolt matches the hole that it's mated to. And you'll see here I have an example. If I check that, I have these two interferences that are matching cosmetic threads, meaning the hole matches the bolt. But you'll see a lot of this isn't. Okay? You'll see a few of these here. And the reason for that, if we look closely at these, is that they are not the same size. In other words, I have what looks to be a M8 screw with an M6 hole. So those are interferences still, but they're not being marked as cosmetic matching threads. And that's the big difference between this and previous versions. You kind of had to lump them all together in a fasteners folder in order for you to ignore them in the interference detection, and it didn't tell you whether or not the cosmetic threads matched. So that's the new functionality for this release, the matching cosmetic threads option. Okay, it's going to create its own folder under cosmetic threads. Another little thing you'll notice is if in previous versions or in previous sessions you've come in and ignored any one or multiple interferences, it is now remembering that. So you don't have to go through and ignore every single time you do interference detection. You can set it to ignore once and it will remember that. In fact, you'll see a little note here that says 2 ignored interferences. It's now going to remember those. And if you'll see a new option down here that says show ignored interferences, it'll actually pop those back up. So here you'll see the 2 ignored interferences from a previous session. So now the ignored interferences option is now saving it back to the file so that you don't have to do it over and over again. So those are a few of the new enhancements to interference detection for the 2013 release. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next thing I'd like to go over are the enhancements to large design review. And let's go ahead and open up a large assembly here. And we'll open it in large design review mode. And what I'd like to go over are a few of the new enhancements for large design review in SOLIDWORKS 2013. And one of the first ones you'll notice is there is no longer an LDR update, large design review update. Now what you have is what we call an update connected component. So if you have referenced documents, you no longer have the LDR update command, you have update connected components. And the same thing goes for updating individual graphics or the component graphics. Now in the right click menu you'll see the update commands. Okay, and this differs from previous versions. You had a button dedicated to update. Now in the latest version of the software it's in the right click menu. And I can do it in 2 places really. I can right click update model graphics right from the very top level and that'll update everything in this assembly. Or I can right click on an individual component and say update component graphics. So those are the 2 ways that I can update model graphics. From previous versions, again slightly different. They're now in the right click context menu. Also new is an option for how updates are handled with large design review. So when I go into the system options and I go to assemblies, you'll see this option right here. When large design review is active, automatically check and update all components. And what that means is upon open of a large design review assembly, it'll automatically look for any updated components and then update them, obviously, right? And the reason this is an option is in the past this is the way it behaved. It was as if this checkbox was on. Okay? So every time you open a large design review assembly, it automatically checked for updates to components. Of course, that takes a second longer. So the idea here is if you want to open it really quickly, you can uncheck this. It will not check for any changes and just open the assembly up. Now, if you prefer older behavior where it looked every single time it opened the assembly for updates, then you would want to check this option. Okay? But just keep in mind now, whenever you open a large design review, by default it is not looking for any updates to any of the components. That's just default behavior in 2013. If you don't like that and you want it to look, you can check this option. Okay. So those are the few enhancements for large design review in 2013. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next enhancement to large assemblies that I think is worth pointing out is an enhancement to multiple configurations. And when you have an assembly with many different configurations, you know performance becomes an issue. And so one thing that we've done about this in the latest release of the software is support purging configuration data from a model. And Maurice went over this in great detail in his configurations CADcast, but I want to go over it again here as well, maybe just a shortened version of that. But what you'll notice in the 2013 version is now when I look at configurations, they either have a dash or a check mark next to them. Okay? And what that means is the configuration is loaded within the file or it has not been loaded. And this is strictly a performance measure. If I had an assembly with hundreds of configurations and I wanted to only load 2 or 3 when I open the model, this would be a good technique for doing that. In previous versions of the software, you really didn't have control over what loaded and what didn't. Now you can tell the software to load a configuration by right-clicking on it, and you'll see an option that says Add Rebuild Save Mark. What this will do is add a little save symbol, and the next time this model is rebuilt or saved, it'll cache this configuration. It'll load that configuration with the file. And that just means that when I go to that configuration, it'll load quickly. The configurations that are not cached will not load as quickly as the ones that are cached within the file. And so again, I think this is helpful for really large assemblies with multiple configurations where performance is a concern. And this should save me some save time, some rebuild time, some open and close time. So the whole idea is, again, it's strictly performance related. Now also with this, the ability to cache and selectively load configurations is a new option that controls it. So if I go to my system options, under performance, you'll see an option here that says purged cache configuration data. And then what this will do is even older assemblies I've created in previous versions of the software, it'll purge that configuration data from the file. And then it's up to you to go in and add, rebuild, save marks to the configurations you want to load every time that assembly opens. Okay? So again, it's just a performance measure, but allows the end user to define what configurations are active or cached when that assembly is opened. Okay. By the way, you can also do this at the top level. So if I right click here at the very top level of my configuration manager, you'll see I can add a rebuild save mark to all configurations or specific configurations, and I can also purge all the data from here as well. So if I want to purge all the configurations just for this one assembly, I can do it from the right click menu here as well. Okay. So those are some enhancements to managing configurations in large assemblies. Alright, so the next feature I'd like to go over, the next enhancement I'd like to go over, is a neat feature to skip rebuild whenever you're opening a file. And I'm just going to open this up. I want to point something out in particular. So if I just open this assembly up, I'm going to open it resolved. And I just want to point out something about SOLIDWORKS and the default way SOLIDWORKS works. So when I open a file, right, I'm sure everybody's seen this before, and I'm just going to add a small chamfer here. Okay, we'll just add a small chamfer to this part right here, like so. And then I go back to my assembly. Anytime I change anything in the part and I jump back to my assembly, you're going to get this prompt. I'm sure everybody's seen it. Model contained within the assembly is changed. Would you like to rebuild the assembly? I say yes, right? Almost everybody says yes to that, and it just rebuilds. Well, now you can disable that box, that dialog box. Okay? What that means is in the system options under assembly, you'll see do not rebuild when switching to assembly window. Now this is a large assembly mode specific setting. It's not global, meaning you're not going to disable that box entirely. You're only going to disable that window, that dialog box, when in large assembly mode. Okay? So again, this option here is new. Do not rebuild when switching to assembly window. And basically what that means is when you modify a file and you go back to your assembly, you're no longer going to get that prompt. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to close these down, and I'm going to open that back up in large assembly mode. Okay, so we'll go back, and I'm going to open this up in large assembly mode. Okay, so of course it loads it lightweight. All the usual large assembly mode indicators are there. I'm going to go ahead and open up this part, and we'll do the same thing. I'm going to add a small chamfer to that face right there. Okay, and now notice when I go back to my assembly, okay, I no longer get that prompt. There's no window here saying would you like to update, models have changed, yes or no, or cancel. That's gone. And it's because of that option that I just pointed out to you. Another thing that's new is when you do this, you're going to get this dialog. So right on the rebuild, you'll see a little icon warning you that it's not up to date. Okay, a little note that says assembly not up to date, rebuild it manually, update settings can be changed in the system options. So again, it's because of that system option that it is not automatically updating. And of course I could come up here and hit rebuild, and that would force it to update. But again, with that option on, it will not automatically rebuild. Okay, so if you're one of those people that doesn't like that dialog box, you use large assembly mode a lot, I think it can be a useful setting for getting back to the assembly quickly without having to constantly hit yes and force it to update. So let's move on. So next on the list are enhancements to SpeedPack, and I'm going to bring up a SpeedPack assembly. And one of the first things you'll notice about SpeedPack assemblies in 2013 is if they're out of date, you'll now get a what's wrong prompt showing you that these SpeedPack subassemblies, in my case, are out of date. Okay? And so no longer do you have to hunt around to find out if they're out of date. You'll now get a prompt when you open that assembly letting you know that SpeedPack subassembly is out of date. Okay, and of course it shows up in the what's wrong dialog, which is where a lot of your errors and other things are going to show up. So just keep that in mind whenever you see this what's wrong dialog and it's mentioning SpeedPack. Chances are it's mentioning the fact that it's out of date and needs to be updated. Now, updating them can be done one of two ways. On the Assembly tab, you'll now see a button that says Update SpeedPack. And of course, it's going to look through the assembly and look for all SpeedPack configurations that are out of date and update them. But I can also do this in the right-click menu. Right? So if I select these two, I know these two are the two that are out of date. I right-click on them. You'll see a new SpeedPack Options drop-down where I can choose Update SpeedPack. Okay? And of course, Update SpeedPack goes back to the original, looks for the changes, and then updates. Okay? We'll do the same thing to this one. I will update SpeedPack. So again, Update SpeedPack is now available in the right-click menu. Okay? Also available in the right-click menu is the ability to create SpeedPack configurations. So for instance, if I wanted to make a SpeedPack configuration out of these two subassemblies, I can control select the two of them. Right-click and you'll see again SpeedPack options and two SpeedPack types. Create mated SpeedPack and graphics SpeedPack. And a mated SpeedPack, what it does is it looks at the mated faces that are in that assembly and automatically includes those in the SpeedPack configuration. So for those that deem the surfaces associated with mates more important, a mated SpeedPack can be pretty useful because it'll automatically find all the faces associated with mates and include those in the SpeedPack configuration. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll click Create Mated SpeedPack, and now if I mouse over it, you'll notice I can select some of these surfaces that have mates associated with them. Okay. Now also I can do what we call a graphic SpeedPack. So I'm going to do that to the next two subassemblies. I'll control select these, right click, and create a graphics SpeedPack. Now in this case, it's just going to create graphics bodies. It's not going to include any faces, so it gives me the best performance. So it really just depends on what I'm looking for in my SpeedPack subassembly. But more importantly, now you have the option, the ability to select from the right-click menu, the ability to create SpeedPack and also to update SpeedPack configurations. Now another thing you might have noticed is as I mouse over this, I'm not getting that weird glowing orb around the cursor that I normally get with SpeedPack. With the 2013 release, there is now an option that controls this. So if I call up options, I'm going to go ahead and do a search. We'll just do a search for SpeedPack. And you'll see there's a new option that allows me to display the SpeedPack graphics circle. Okay? And with this checked, I hit OK. I get that usual graphics circle associated, a lot of people associate with SpeedPack. Okay? So again, you now have an option to disable this graphics circle with the latest release of SolidWorks. So let's move on. So the next thing I want to point out is some enhancements to mirroring subassemblies, and in particular how mates are handled in mirrored subassemblies. And what I mean by this is when I do a mirror of a subassembly and I create opposite hand versions, it oftentimes created issues with mates. And what I mean by that is certain mates just wouldn't carry over. You get a message saying these mates didn't carry over, and you had to come back and recreate those mates in the mirrored subassembly. In the 2013 release, much of this should be resolved. And this is because they've added the functionality, the ability to carry over mates that were tied to the default planes or origin of the subassembly. And this was the problem in the past, is when you wanted to create an opposite hand version, much of that stuff wouldn't be mirrored over, and so therefore the mates would not carry over as well. That's no longer the case with SOLIDWORKS 2013, and I want to point out an example of this. So here I have this subassembly, and I'd like to mirror this subassembly over to this side, but also create an opposite hand version. And so this is a common workflow in SOLIDWORKS, but the one thing I want to point out is the way this subassembly is mated. If I go into the subassembly, you'll notice one of these components, one of the mates associated, is tied to the assembly origin. Right? So you'll see this mate here, this temporary axis is aligned to the subassembly origin. And so this is a perfect example of something that would not have carried over in previous versions of the software. This mate would have had to have been recreated in previous versions of the software. So let's just jump through it real quick. It's not all that difficult to show. I'm going to go ahead and do a mirror components. We'll mirror about the right plane, right? And we'll select this subassembly. Okay. And I'm going to create an opposite hand version of this pillar. Okay, so we'll click create opposite hand version. And of course that means that the assembly origin would flip, the default planes may not be in the same position as they were before. So this is really what we got to consider, and one of the big reasons it was a limitation in previous versions is now we're flipping a lot of those things around. And so now I'm going to hit next. We'll just create derived configurations. I'm not worried about creating whole new files. And I'll go ahead and hit OK. Okay. And really what you'll notice now is it just simply works. But the big difference is that when I go into these mirror components and I look at the subassembly, you'll notice that that mate, we pointed out here, still exists. So you'll see coincident 2, and it's again tied to the origin. So that's an example of something I wouldn't have been able to do in previous versions. In previous versions, you would have had to have recreated that mate in order to get it into the correct location. Okay, so that's the enhancement to mirrored subassemblies and how they pertain to mates in particular. Alright, so moving on, the next thing I'd like to go over are the enhancements to mass properties and also the new center of mass feature. So let's go bring up an example of this. One of the first things I'm going to go over are the enhancements to mass properties. And mass properties got an overhaul in terms of interface, also in terms of functionality. And some of this I'm sure will be covered in the Parts and Features CAD-cast, but I'd like to go over it as well. If I go to Tools, Mass Properties, you'll notice first off the interface is different. Okay, so the interface has been overhauled. A lot of the same information as we had in previous versions, but it looks slightly different. Also new is the ability to override inertia properties. Okay, and we've always had the ability to override mass properties. But now in the 2013 release, if I click this, you'll see we now have an option to override the moments of inertia for a particular assembly or for a particular component. So I think this might be useful. Maybe if I'm using a dumbed down model but I want to get accurate moments of inertia, I can override the values with accurate values and still use a stripped down or a dumbed down version of the model. So there's a couple different use cases for overriding the moments of inertia, but again, now you can do that in the 2013 release. Also new is the center of mass feature. Okay, so under reference geometry, you'll see a new command called center of mass. And just like the name implies, what it does is it creates a center of mass feature in your feature tree and shows an annotation, a little icon, where the center of mass is in this particular assembly. Now you can also create this feature right in mass properties. Right? You'll see an option here, create. Actually, it's gone now that I don't have it. But you'll see here an option, create center of mass feature. So there are two ways to really create center of mass features, either through the insert reference geometry or from the mass properties dialog. But you'll see what it gives me is this center of mass feature in the feature tree. Okay? It also makes measuring really easy. I can take measurements from that center of mass feature. It's a selectable entity now, so I can take measurements from it to other faces, other things in the model. Also, what's nice about this is it can show part level center of mass as well. So let me show you what I mean. If I open up this part and we'll insert a center of mass feature, okay, I go back to my assembly, what you'll notice is now I have this little icon here, okay, showing me the center of mass of that part. And the nice thing about this is you can actually add mates that are associated with this. So let me drag out a copy of this. So here's a copy of that same file. And now what I want to point out is you can mate relative to that center of mass. So maybe I had the situation where I'm really worried about balance or symmetry, maybe for vibration purposes or whatever, and I want the center of the mass of a particular component to be X amount from the assembly center, right? I can do that by constraining the center of mass of a part to, for instance, the right plane of the assembly, right? Or anything else. It just is an example. But it just goes to show you now you can tie the center of mass of a component to anything using a mate. Okay? So for those really concerned about balance, or maybe it's vibration they're concerned about, I think that can be particularly helpful. So that's the center of mass feature and the updates to mass properties in SOLIDWORKS 2013. Let's move on to the next thing. So the next thing on the list are the enhancements to snapshots. And I'd like to bring up an example just because in previous versions, snapshots were particular to large design review. So you didn't really see the command for snapshot when you loaded an assembly lightweight, or you loaded SpeedPack, you loaded fully resolved. You never saw the option for snapshot. It was only when you loaded an assembly in large design review that you actually saw the snapshot command. Well, in the SOLIDWORKS 2013 version, we now have the ability to take snapshots from fully resolved models, lightweight models, and view those in large design review. And it doesn't matter whether you create it in large design review or you create it in lightweight mode. It doesn't matter where you create the snapshot. It will be visible in all those modes. Right? So it doesn't matter where I create the snapshot because it'll be available in any mode I decide to open the assembly in. So that's one of the big changes in 2013. We now support snapshots when you're loading fully resolved, lightweight, whatever the mode might be. Okay, so I can now take snapshots right from here. Also new is the ability to take snapshots while in a walkthrough. Now walkthrough is not new. It's been around for a few years now. But if I go ahead and create a walkthrough, and I'm just going to create a real basic walkthrough, we'll move it down here. And let's say that, for instance, I wanted to get a good image of some of these internal components that are here. Okay, I move into the right position. Let's say that's my snapshot that I like. Well, now, while in walkthrough, you'll notice one of the few buttons that I have is this Take Snapshot. So from here, I can click Take Snapshot, give it a name. We'll just call it Internals. And that'll create a snapshot inside the walkthrough. And what this means is if I get out of the walkthrough, I now have under Snapshots this Internals snapshot. And you actually see the icon's a little bit different, letting me know this is part of a walkthrough. And whenever I select this snapshot, it's going to automatically put me back into that walkthrough. So it's an easy way to get back to a particular view, a particular orientation of the model. And of course, snapshots are more than just views. They also capture the hide show states of things, and you can add comments. So it's a little bit more than just a custom view. But now it's supported. I can now create snapshots right from the walkthrough. Okay. So that's the enhancements to snapshots for the 2013 release. Again, the big one is support for snapshots in any mode of the assembly, okay, and viewing snapshots in any mode of the assembly. But also now support for adding or creating snapshots in a walkthrough. Okay, so almost through all the features. One of the last things I want to point out is a new assembly feature for SOLIDWORKS 2013. And if I bring up an assembly here, it's basically just a new assembly feature. Okay, we now support swept cuts in assembly features. And it's just like much of the other assembly features that you see in this list. They're assembly specific but have the ability to be pushed down to the part level. Now with 2013 we support swept cuts. So it's pretty straightforward. If you've ever done a sweep, it's really the same steps, but now you have a few more options as it pertains to assembly level features. So let me show you. Let's build a real quick assembly cut. Here I have a sketch. Right, I'm going to take that and we'll do a swept cut. And I'll just use this edge as my path reference. And you'll see, much like all the other assembly features, I have options to propagate feature to parts. I can specify components. I'm not going to change any of this. I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. And there's our assembly cut sweep. Okay, assembly swept cut. And of course, if I open this up, it does not exist at the part level because, again, it's an assembly feature. Okay, so just like all the other assembly features, it only exists in this particular assembly. You'll see here, cut sweep 1. So again, this was not available. It was not a command you could do at the assembly level as an assembly feature in previous versions of the software. Now it works. Okay. So that's the swept cut command in the assemblies feature. Let's move on to the last thing. Alright, so the last thing I'd like to go over are some enhancements to the interface when selecting subassemblies. And so I'm going to bring up top level assembly, this track setting machine I've had open a few times now. And I just want to point out some enhancements to selecting subassemblies from the graphics area. And so in previous versions, select subassembly was a commonly used tool but not entirely effective. And what I mean by that is when you had an assembly with several subassemblies within that, right? So here's an example of an assembly with several subassemblies below that. It was never very clear which subassembly it was selecting. It was always selecting the next level up. And if you had 2 or 3 or 4 levels, you had to do that 2 or 3 times or go to the feature tree and select it. There was no easy way for you to select the top level subassembly that it belongs to. Well, now in the latest version of the software, whenever you right click a file and you say select subassembly, you're going to get a list. You'll see here. So it's going to show you each of the subassemblies that that part belongs to. Okay, and if I had 3 or 4, you'd see 3 or 4 listed there, so it's an easy way for me to select which one I'm actually referring to. In previous versions, it just defaulted to the next level up. But now you're going to get this box allowing you to choose which one you'd like. Another new feature is when I select this, and I select this, for instance, this subassembly, I also get this pop-up context menu. This context menu did not come up in previous versions. So you would have to right-click, select subassembly, then go back over to your feature tree and do whatever command you're trying to do, open, edit, whatever it may have been. Now you get a context menu whenever you select a subassembly, and that's one little tweak that they've done in this version now that makes it a little more similar to other functionality in SolidWorks. So again, when you right-click, select subassembly, you're going to get a context menu that pops up as well. Okay, so those are the enhancements to select subassembly. And those are the enhancements to assemblies for the 2013 release. So, thank you for joining. Please visit us at www.ddicad.com.